A millionaire marries his newly hired unattractive maid on a bet, but what he discovers on their wedding night leaves him shocked. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The Montero Club was alive with extravagance. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the scent of expensive cigars filled the air. It was a place where the rich and powerful gathered, where business deals were made over whiskey, and where arrogance was the currency of the night. Sitting in the VIP lounge, Nicholas Ford, a billionaire who had never known failure, leaned back in his leather seat, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room lazily. He had everything: money, power, and an endless supply of women who fought for his attention. Ford, his best friend, Victor Langston, called out with a smirk. "Tell me, have you ever done something truly ridiculous for fun?" Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "Everything I do is fun." The men around them chuckled, all eager for a night of reckless entertainment. Victor leaned forward, his grin widening. "I have a challenge for you." "A real one," Victor said, his tone dripping with amusement. "Marry the most unattractive woman you can find. Not just date her, marry her, and stay with her for 6 months. No luxury treatment, no backing out." Laughter erupted around the table. The idea was absurd. Nicholas Ford, stuck in a marriage with a plain, undesirable woman? Impossible. Nicholas smirked. "That's it? That's your grand challenge?" Victor raised his glass. "That's it. Unless, of course, you're afraid." Nicholas rolled his eyes. "And what do I get if I win?" Victor shrugged. $1 million. Nicholas scoffed. "That's not even worth my time." "Then do it for fun," Victor taunted. "Unless you think you'd actually lose." Silence fell. The men waited for Nicholas's reaction. He never turned down a bet, especially not one as ridiculous as this. His pride wouldn't allow it. "Fine," Nicholas said, his voice confident. "I'll do it." Victor grinned and pointed across the room. "Then meet your future wife." Nicholas followed his gaze and frowned. Eleanor Ellie Hart. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a model or a socialite. She was one of his maids, dressed in a baggy uniform, her hair tied in a messy bun, and large glasses covering half her face. She was the exact opposite of the women Nicholas usually surrounded himself with. She moved quietly, professionally, completely uninterested in the flashy world around her. Nicholas scoffed. "You're joking." Victor smirked. "Nope. Unless you want to back out." Nicholas stared at Ellie again. She was adjusting the napkins on a tray, oblivious to the fact that she had just become part of a cruel game. Nicholas smirked. "Consider it done." He had no idea this bet would change everything. Ellie moved swiftly through the grand kitchen of Nicholas Ford's mansion, wiping down the counters as the quiet hum of the city night filled the space. She was used to working late, keeping to herself, avoiding any unnecessary interaction. Rich men were all the same, entitled, arrogant, and playing games with other people's lives. Tonight would prove that theory right. Nicholas Ford, dressed in a crisp shirt with the top buttons undone, leaned against the marble countertop, watching her like a predator observing prey. "Ellie," he said smoothly, his voice laced with amusement. She didn't stop working. "Sir," she acknowledged without looking up. Nicholas smirked at her indifference. Most women craved his attention. She didn't even care. "I have an offer for you," he continued. Ellie sighed, setting the cloth down. "If you want your coffee, the machine is over there." Nicholas chuckled. She had no idea what was coming. "Not coffee. Marriage." Ellie's head snapped up, her brows furrowing in confusion. Did she hear him right? "Excuse me?" Nicholas took a step closer, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Marry me. For 6 months." Ellie blinked, waiting for the punchline. When it didn't come, she scoffed. "You're insane." "I'm serious." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm not interested." Nicholas's smirk didn't falter. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and slid it across the counter. Inside was a check with more zeros than Ellie had ever seen in her life. "That's how interested I am," he said. Ellie stared at the check, her throat tightening. That money could save her mother. could wipe away all her debt, give her a new start. But at what cost? She pushed it back. I'm not for sale. Nicholas tilted his head, intrigued. Everyone has a price. Her fists clenched. Then you're talking to the wrong woman. He sighed, clearly expecting this. Ellie, you'll have a contract. Legal protection. A guaranteed exit after 6 months. You'll be financially set for life. All you have to do is play the role of my wife. Ellie hesitated, every part of her screaming no. But then her mother's weak voice echoed in her mind. The endless hospital visits. The medical bills she couldn't pay. The sleepless nights wondering how to survive another month. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was survival. Her fingers trembled as she looked back up at Nicholas. He was arrogant, selfish, and the last man she'd ever want to be tied to. But this was temporary. Just 6 months. Then she could walk away. She took a deep breath and nodded. Fine, she whispered. I'll do it. Nicholas's smirk widened. He thought he had won. But Ellie had her own reasons for saying yes. The wedding was as cold and emotionless as a business transaction. The grand ballroom of an exclusive hotel was filled with Nicholas's elite friends, all smirking and whispering behind crystal champagne glasses. There were no flowers, no family members. Just expensive suits, designer gowns, and an air of amusement at the ridiculous spectacle. Nicholas stood at the altar, bored and unaffected. His black tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his expression unreadable as he checked the time on his watch. When Ellie walked down the aisle, the room erupted in soft chuckles and murmurs. She looks like a schoolteacher. Ford really lost this bet. Nicholas barely acknowledged her. He saw the same maid he had hired weeks ago. Oversized dress, thick glasses, hair tied in a tight bun. Ellie, however, showed no emotion. She didn't flinch at the cruel whispers, didn't react to the mockery. She just walked straight toward Nicholas, calm and unreadable. The officiant cleared his throat. Do you, Nicholas Ford, take Eleanor Hart to be your lawfully wedded wife? Nicholas exhaled sharply, barely suppressing a smirk. I do. The officiant turned to Ellie. Do you, Eleanor Hart, take Nicholas Ford to be your lawfully wedded husband? Ellie hesitated just for a second. Then, she met Nicholas's gaze, her eyes cool and knowing. I do. A few more chuckles from the guests. A meaningless kiss on the cheek. A signature on a piece of paper. And just like that, Eleanor Hart was Mrs. Ford. Nicholas barely looked at Ellie during the reception. His friends toasted to his ridiculous win, laughing as they made sarcastic comments about his wife and how he would endure the next 6 months. Ellie, however, remained quiet, unfazed by it all. That should have annoyed Nicholas. Instead, he found himself glancing at her more than he expected. By the time the party ended, Nicholas was eager for the night to be over. He didn't expect anything from this marriage. Ellie was nothing more than a contract, a game. When he entered their shared bedroom that night, he was prepared to find her already asleep, hidden under layers of blankets like a ghost he could ignore. But when he stepped inside, he froze. Ellie stood by the large window, looking out at the city lights. And for the first time, Nicholas saw her. Really saw her. Her thick glasses were gone, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes. Her hair, no longer tied up, cascaded down in soft waves. The oversized uniform had been replaced by an elegant yet simple nightgown that fit her perfectly. Nicholas's mouth went dry. Ellie was stunning. He had never noticed before, blinded by his assumptions and the way she had deliberately hidden herself. Why? Ellie turned, meeting his gaze. For a brief second, a flicker of amusement crossed her face, as if she had been expecting this reaction. Nicholas took a slow step forward, his confidence faltering for the first time. You, he started, but he didn't know what he wanted to say. Ellie tilted her head. Is something wrong, Mr. Ford? The use of his last name made his jaw tighten. Something about this woman, his wife, wasn't adding up. And for the first time, Nicholas Ford wondered, had he just played himself? The moment Ellie moved into Nicholas Ford's penthouse, everything changed. Nicholas had expected her to be overwhelmed by the luxury, to gawk at the $1 million furniture, to hesitate before stepping on the Persian rugs, to feel small in the presence of wealth. But she didn't. She walked through the grand hallways as if she had lived in places like this before. She didn't ask about the expensive artwork, didn't comment on the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows, and didn't act grateful. It irritated him. From day one, Ellie refused to play the role of the obedient, grateful wife. Nicholas had sent his personal shopper to get her a wardrobe full of designer dresses, heels, and jewelry. But when she opened the boxes, she barely glanced at them before closing them again. "You don't like them?" Nicholas asked, frowning. Ellie shrugged. "They're nice, just not for me." The next morning, Nicholas walked into the dining area, expecting to see Ellie enjoying the five-star breakfast prepared by his private chef. Instead, she was in the kitchen scrambling eggs in a pan. Nicholas stared. "You know we have people for that." Ellie didn't even look up. "I don't need people for everything." She ate her simple meal at the kitchen counter, leaving the extravagant spread on the dining table untouched. Nicholas was used to women throwing themselves at his lifestyle. Ellie? She acted like it meant nothing. Nicholas's social circle didn't make things easy for her. At one of his elite gatherings, Sophie, an ex-fling, smirked at Ellie over a glass of champagne. "Ellie, darling," she said sweetly, "it must be quite the upgrade for you. Tell me, do you still clean houses on the weekends? Or is being Mrs. Ford a full-time job now?" The group laughed. Nicholas was about to step in, but before he could, Ellie smiled back. "Oh, I don't mind cleaning," she said casually, sipping her water. "If I had known you were coming, I would have brought a mop." Silence. Nicholas choked on his drink. Sophie's face turned red, while the others looked away, pretending not to hear. Ellie had won that round effortlessly, and Nicholas found himself smirking. The more time Nicholas spent around Ellie, the more she confused him. One evening, he found her in his private library, reading an advanced finance book. Nicholas leaned against the doorway. "You understand that?" Ellie closed the book calmly. "Doesn't everyone?" "No, not everyone. Not a maid." Nicholas studied her carefully. She carried herself differently, spoke with quiet confidence, and never seemed out of place. She wasn't desperate for wealth. She wasn't intimidated by power, and something about that unsettled him. Who exactly had he married? And why did he have a feeling that she wasn't the one playing the game? Nicholas Ford was not a man who ignored his instincts, and right now his instincts were screaming at him. Something about Ellie didn't make sense. He had married her expecting a quiet, simple girl who would be easy to ignore. Instead, she carried herself with an unusual grace, never seemed intimidated by wealth, and didn't react the way he expected. And that bothered him. Nicholas Ford didn't like not knowing things, so he decided to dig into Ellie's past. Nicholas hired a private investigator to do a full background check. He expected to receive a detailed report, where she grew up, where she went to school, who her family was. Instead, the investigator returned with almost nothing. No school records, no medical history, no trace of her existence before 5 years ago. Nicholas stared at the empty file, his fingers tapping against his desk. This wasn't normal. Who was she before she became a maid? And what was she hiding? The night in the library. One night, unable to sleep, Nicholas walked into his private library. He expected the room to be empty. Instead, he found Ellie. She was sitting in a large leather chair, the dim light casting a soft glow over her face. In her hands was an old, rare philosophy book, one written entirely in Latin. Nicholas stopped in his tracks. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her brows were slightly furrowed as she turned the pages, completely engrossed. Nicholas cleared his throat. "You understand that?" Ellie looked up, completely unfazed. She calmly closed the book. "Doesn't everyone?" Nicholas felt something cold settle in his chest. "No, not everyone. Not a maid." He stepped closer, his blue eyes narrowing. "Where did you learn Latin?" Ellie simply smiled. "Where does anyone learn anything?" It wasn't an answer. It was a deflection. Nicholas stared at her, his mind racing. This woman, his wife, was not who she claimed to be. And for the first time since this bet started, he realized he might not be the one in control. Nicholas hadn't planned on falling for Ellie. At first, she was just a bet, a contract, a temporary arrangement. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized she was different from anyone he had ever known. She wasn't impressed by wealth. She didn't crave his approval. And despite the way his world tried to break her, she never once let them see her crack. And somehow that made him want her even more. But just as Nicholas was beginning to accept his feelings, everything came crashing down. The grand ballroom was filled with New York's most powerful people. It was one of Nicholas's exclusive business events, and for the first time, Ellie stood beside him. Not as a maid, not as a stranger, but as his wife. For the first time, Nicholas wasn't ashamed to have her by his side. But then Victor stepped forward, his smirk full of cruelty. "Nicholas," he called out, raising his glass. "I just have one question. Was the $1 million bet worth it?" Silence. Nicholas went rigid. Ellie turned to him slowly, her face unreadable. "What bet?" Nicholas felt his stomach drop. Victor chuckled, delighted in the chaos he was about to cause. "Oh, Ford didn't tell you?" He turned to Ellie. "Darling, you were just a game. A joke. A challenge." Nicholas had to marry the most unattractive woman he could find. For a bet, the room went dead silent. Ellie didn't speak for a moment. She just stared at Nicholas. Then, in the quietest voice, she asked, "Tell me it's not true." Nicholas couldn't. And in that moment, Ellie knew. She set down her untouched champagne glass, exhaled softly, and turned around. Nicholas reached for her. "Ellie." She stepped away. "I don't want your money," she whispered. Then she walked out of the room, out of his house, out of his life. And this time, Nicholas didn't win. Nicholas had never chased anyone before. But now he had to find her. For weeks, he searched for Ellie, but she had vanished. She had left no trail, no contact, no explanation. It was like she had never existed. Until one night, his private investigator returned with a file. And what Nicholas discovered left him speechless. Ellie Hart didn't exist. Her real name? Eleanor Kensington. Nicholas's breath caught as he read the report. Ellie wasn't just anyone. She was the lost heir to the Kensington Empire, one of the wealthiest families in Europe. But her family had been ruined years ago, forcing her into hiding. She hadn't been a maid because she had no choice. She had been a maid because she was rebuilding her life. And Nicholas had just lost the only woman he had ever truly wanted. For the first time in his life, he let go of his shallow world. He cut off Victor and the toxic elite. He sold his penthouse, left the meaningless parties, and focused on something real. Because he knew that if he ever saw her again, he wanted to be worthy of her love. It had been a year since Ellie walked out of Nicholas Ford's life. She had disappeared completely, choosing a life far from wealth, from deception, from the world that had betrayed her. Now, she lived in a quiet coastal town, working in a small bookstore, embracing the simple life she had fought so hard to create. She never expected to see him again. But one rainy afternoon, as she arranged books on a shelf, she felt a familiar presence. Slowly, she turned. Nicholas stood at the entrance. No expensive suit, no arrogant smirk. Just a man who had changed. His eyes, once filled with confidence and control, now held nothing but sincerity. "I finally found you," he said softly. Ellie didn't move. She just watched him, waiting. Nicholas took a step closer. "I don't want your money. I don't want a deal. I just want a second chance." Ellie studied him carefully. This wasn't the same man she had left. She could see it, the regret, the growth, the man he had become. For the first time, she let her guard down. A small, genuine smile crossed her lips. "Okay," she whispered. And just like that, karma had rewarded the right choices. What do you think about this story? Do you believe in second chances? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing stories. See you in the next one.